Before I introduce what we're about to do tonight and the guests, let me introduce myself in a proper way, and then let me set some ground rules for the chat and so forth. And then we'll get into the conversation. So my name is Amber Archuleta Lucero. I teach at El Paso Community College. I have been there since 2008. So I want to let you know how grateful I am that you're attending tonight. This has been on my mind for a really long time. Maybe since the documentary came out in December. And so I hope really tonight is an incredible conversation. And I hope that the conversation continues in terms of what happened in Uvalde. So let me introduce the other individuals who will be part of the conversation tonight. Kiva, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes. Hi, I'm Kiva Lucero. I am Dr. A's son. I'm also a current student at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. And I'm really excited to talk about this issue that's been going on for the past couple of years and the wider issues around it. And I'm very grateful to Ms. Kriel for being here with us today. Thank you.
Let me introduce why we're here tonight. This is Lomi Kriel from ProPublica, Texas Tribune, investigative reporter. For a long time now, she has been on the ground. I'll talk to her tonight about some of her experiences here in El Paso in 2019. She covered the Santa Fe Springs shooting and most recently Uvalde. So lots to talk about tonight. Lomi, welcome to EPCC Talks. Welcome to the wider community. I know we have people here from Austin Community College. We have people here. I see some of my friends from Arkansas. I see a lot of different people here. Kiva's in the East Coast. So formally welcome. And we're so glad to have you here tonight.
Thanks, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly. Yes.
Okay, great.
In any conversation that we're having, I want to emphasize we want to respect each other in terms of our beliefs, our ideology, our social construct. So let's please keep that in mind as we go into such a heavy topic as tonight. I want to also let you know this is content that is very mature. This is content that has a lot of depth to it. This is content that is driven by a ton of emotion. So I just want to let you know that as we go into tonight's conversation, I'll be playing several clips, some from the Department of Justice, a majority from Ms. Kriel's documentary, some from a city council meeting with parents in Uvalde. So I just want to let you know that in terms of language, in terms of content, this is mature content. So those of you who are sensitive to what we're about to get into, please understand, we want to have this conversation, but we also want to give you prior warning as to what we're, about to articulate. It's been about 2 years now that these incredible individuals have passed. And I wanted to start out with saying that truly my heart is always with focusing on trying to place attention on what happened 2 years ago in Uvalde. I'm hoping that tonight, although may not be the panacea for the world's problems, tonight may be an opportunity yet once again to be reminded why we're here, of the 22 individuals that we lost here in Uvalde. This is a mural of those individuals, many coming from the Tribune itself. Before we get into the documentary, let me ask Ms. Kriel to jump in here. This documentary is, I know, is sort of a village. It's just not you, but I know a number of people that have helped you produce this, your team that went through this. And I just wanted to make sure that I acknowledge those: Ms. Kriel, Juanita Ceballos, Michelle Meisner, Lexi Churchill, and Zinentel Hernandez. Anybody else that I'm missing?
So Jeannie and Lexi and Juanita, we were kind of the main people on the ground. Michelle and Lauren helped produce this, and Sahira Torres, who's actually from El Paso and lives in El Paso, was the editor for the accompanying story that ran with this.
And so I just wanted to make sure that, we're acknowledging the work that you've done, you and your team. I know it was a team sitting through all of this and putting this together for at least a year. Before I get into parts of the documentary, let me just ask you a little bit about the process of handling such a large amount of material and trying to condense and synthesize that material where it makes sense to the viewer. And so let me start there. When you're looking at, I think you mentioned this word a couple times in the video, a trove of material such as this, huge amounts of body cam of almost 380 officers transcribing that material, then going through that material and then comprising the documentary. Can you just give me some insight, Ms. Kriel, on what it takes to be able to reach that culmination of having a video on PBS Frontline being finished, but being able just to get into the details of that material? What is that like? And when do you decide what to edit out?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I would start by saying that this has been a 2-year process for us. We started reporting on Uvalde the day that it happened, along with my colleagues at the Texas Tribune. We filed more than 70 public information requests that day to try to attempt to understand a little bit more about what happened. Those were all blocked, and we can talk more about that. We've been fighting that in a lawsuit ever since. And so ever since that day, we've been trying to take little steps at what happened by, I think it's important for you viewers to understand just how little information was publicly available in those first few months, and how much disinformation actually there was. So as we were fighting this lawsuit to obtain this information that we hope will be released and will be available to the public if we win, we separately obtained, as I've said to you, this massive trove of investigative materials through a confidential source. And we started writing about that and going through that data in the latter part of 2022. So we published several stories using that material, but there was still so much information to go through that at the beginning of last year, we decided to team up with Frontline to both produce this documentary, but also this, kind of very comprehensive 6,000 word story that looks at different parts of the response and attempts to reconstruct what we know of what happened that day, understanding that there are still, many questions and many things we still don't know. So it was overwhelming is the short answer to your question, and remains overwhelming just because of the amount of material and the way that it was organized. I mean, I think it was not organized. There were lots of files, didn't make sense. Not, interviews were not transcribed. We had to manually transcribe them. We actually developed an AI tool to help us with the transcription because we didn't want to put, this is very sensitive information. We didn't want to put it on Otter and risk having this come out without, our oversight. So we also reviewed, nearly 3 dozen body cameras, and it wasn't just the body cameras. It was identifying people through the interviews, through other records that was in the data that we had, as well as compiling a list of officers who responded. That was not something that was publicly available, and then requesting their training files. So it was an extensive process, and I think that perhaps some people who read the story or look at the documentary think that all this information was in what we obtained, and that's absolutely not the case. I mean, there's a reason why it took us a year to go through all this.
There always is, right, a story that you're trying to tell, but when you're trying to piece it together, things remain a mystery until you can really look at that. And I would assume, and I've never done what you've accomplished, and I'm so happy you're here tonight. But that, I know that takes patience. I know that takes a lot of mental patience to be able to sit through and look through and see where things piece together. Let's see if we can now look at this documentary. So those of you who are on, let me explain what we're about to see. So in December 2023, when we may have been on break already, I ran into this documentary on Frontline PBS. and became obsessed with it, really, in a very short word. I had been, like many of us, just emotionally traumatized by what happened in Uvalde. And so when I saw Miss Kriel's documentary, I focused on it. I had it as a project for my students. And then I began, I think, emailing Miss Kriel almost every, month. Please, are you able to come? Please, we'll do it virtually. So I'm grateful she's here. Let me tell you what you're about to see. This is about an hour documentary, and what Carol and I have done, my producer, who is also on with me tonight, is we've tried to condense that even more into about 8 minutes. So what you're about to see tonight, if I can explain some of the details, and then I'll come back to Ms. Kriel, because I want to ask her about some of the depth that we can capture with just this very short conversation tonight, as it relates to what her findings were. So the very first part of the documentary starts with Pete Arredondo, who is the former chief of the Uvalde school police, and he is giving orders and running. And then you'll see sort of Miss Kriel coming into the picture, talking a little bit about, what she and I just articulated. The second part that we get into of the documentary is some of the interviews from the police officers who were present, as well as some of the actual body cam footage in the hallway. So in the documentary, as you'll see, and I'm hoping you do spend some time to watch that documentary, what you'll see is large amounts of time being spent, 77 minutes actually being spent in the hallway. And so there are body cam and audio of those officers. So in this part of the clip, you'll also see that, and at the very top right, if you'll notice, there's actual names of the officers who have their body cam on, like Officer Zamora. There is an interview that you will hear on here from one of the officers, Mr. Coronado, who was present, and he is giving an interview to one of the Texas Rangers. And in the interview, he is explaining some of his distress as he was moving some of the survivors from point A to point B. The very last part of this 8-minute compilation is where Ms. Kriel is just talking about some of the things at the very end as she kind of finished that part of the documentary. And then please, as you watch, again, keep in mind the depth of this and the reason why we're here tonight, and trying to maybe understand just a little bit better of what happened that day.
Okay, Uvalde, they're saying that he's possibly in the building on the... Hold on! Get inside! Go! Shots fired inside the building!
There was no question about it. It's gunfire. We need to get in there.
In a special investigation with ProPublica and the Texas Tribune.
In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, it was clear that something had gone terribly wrong.
With firsthand accounts of the response.
And honestly, didn't think anybody was in there besides the gunman.
The missteps.
We couldn't find a way to work together.
Chain of command is everything, and it was not there.
And the trauma.
Child call 911. The room is full of victims. Understand this is a job we signed up for, but none of us have never been in this type of situation.
Now on Frontline, inside the Uvalde Response.
"21 people killed, including 19 young students.
The second deadliest school shooting in U.S. history."
In the immediate aftermath of the shooting in Uvalde, officers were praised for how they'd responded.
Law enforcement officials did what they do. They showed amazing courage by running toward gunfire.
But quickly, a different story began to emerge.
There were growing concerns today about how police responded to the deadly elementary school massacre in Uvalde, Texas. He managed to stay inside for an hour.
After the governor praised the response, and then it turned out that was almost the opposite that happened. We knew that we had to figure out what really occurred that day and ask questions about why it all went so wrong.
Lomi Kriel is an investigative reporter with ProPublica and the Texas Tribune. For over a year, she and a team of reporters have been analyzing the trove of evidence they obtained and writing about the breakdowns in the response.
This is the first time we have ever received this amount of information for a mass shooting. Frankly, it's typically rare to get this for any kind of criminal case, but particularly for mass shootings, where that is often withheld for years if it's ever released publicly. What we did was line up the more than 24 body cams, go through it, try to identify officers, transcribe the body cameras, and then start pouring through the hundreds of hours of law enforcement interviews that are on this file.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? This is an emergency right now. I'm inside the building with this man. He has an AR-15.
He hears about the teacher's call and that the gunman likely shot a person in one of the classrooms.
Is the teacher with him in the classroom?
She's in another classroom. She's in 102. Room 102. And another person possibly shot across from her. They're not sure.
Okay. So we have him in a room. He's at AR-15. He's shot a lot. He's in a room. He hasn't come out yet. We're surrounded, but I don't have a radio with me. She said all the units know he's going to be in.
Okay, so the shooter's in one of the rooms. What room number, Pete?
Yes, he's going to be in room 9, 10, 11, 12. He's either in room 111 or 112.
Take your time to get the emotional.
It's all right, man. This is incredibly traumatic. This is.
I can see the fear in their face. I knew they.
You good?
I didn't even cry about this at all.
It's all right, man. Hey, take your time, bro. We're gonna pause the recording. She's good, buddy.
37 minutes into the standoff, a police dispatcher reaches a student who'd called 911 minutes earlier.
Hello? I'm calling with the police. Are you okay? No, there's a school shooting. Okay, yes, ma'am. I have multiple units there. Are you with officers or are you barricaded somewhere? I'm in the classroom. What's the classroom number? 112. 112. 112. 112, yes, ma'am. What's your name, ma'am? Chloe Toilet, please hurry. There's a lot of dead bodies. I don't understand all these situations. My dad taught me when I was a little girl. Just hope one of my teachers are still alive, but they're shot. Okay, please, someone's trying to get to me. Chloe, okay? Please, I can't wait.
Okay. Let's get kids. Yes, let's get kids. You okay? What's your bar? Kids.
The BORTEC commander, he finally gets the right key from a school employee, puts it in the door, opens the door. The gunman jumps outside of a closet and fires at BORTEC officers at the front of the stack. He grazes one of them in the head. Multiple officers fire back and hits the gunman and kills him.
EMTs first! EMTs first!
What we later learn, and the state committee that examined the response determined, is that the door was likely unlocked this entire time.
Nineteen students and 2 teachers were fatally shot in Uvalde. Most of them likely during the initial 2 minutes of gunfire before police entered the school. 2 students and a teacher died soon after being rescued. Among them, Eva Mireles, who had called her husband from her classroom early in the standoff. Texas has now increased the amount of active shooter training for all law enforcement in the state. Of the hundreds of officers who responded that day, several have resigned, been reassigned, or retired.
Lomi, when you were going through all that body cam footage and then going through the interviews, did you notice as a reporter, this isn't your first school shooting, did you notice some alignment in what officers were saying and what you were actually witnessing as it related to the body cam footage during those interviews, during those Texas Rangers interviews?
Yeah, so I think what is important is that this isn't my first school shooting and also not my first mass shooting. However, in the other cases, particularly Santa Fe, where that criminal case is ongoing and actually very little information has been released. El Paso obviously was a slightly different situation, being at the Walmart. The police response is not necessarily so much in question. I think what's really different here is, although there's been such a lack of information, we have also had this information that was because certain sources were concerned about what was being said publicly, that they shared this material. So actually this type of information is very unusual to have. I think I said that in the documentary. So it's hard to really compare it. I mean, I think even in other mass shootings like Sandy Hook and Pulse, like Parkland, in Parkland there was a criminal case, and although a lot of information came out in that trial in which the officer was ultimately acquitted, it's still, I think, not to the degree of actually the information that we obtained. So this is pretty rare, and I think that's why as well we spent the time to make a documentary as well as a story. I will say though that to the second part of your question, actually a lot of the officers' interviews did align with their actions in the body cam. I mean, they were not necessarily lying or at all, frankly, in their interviews with the Rangers. I would say certainly they were very traumatized themselves about what happened. And this is not to apologize for their actions. I mean, I think we all agree now that in totality it was a failed response. That's super clear. But I mean, I think what is clear when you look at the body cams and then you listen to the interviews, they had different understandings, and now they were the wrong understandings of what was going on. But what they recalled about what happened, for the most part, aligns with how they acted. It was also, I think, important to see their perspective that they did have these regrets. I mean, this is very rare to get this kind of perspective from officers. They are still currently involved in ongoing criminal case, lots of civil lawsuits, and other things. So none of them really, other than Chief Arredondo, has commented publicly at all. So, hearing their own perspective, you do see that they do have regrets and that they do feel like the mistakes were made, right? And very clear among those mistakes is the fact that no one took charge and no one questioned it. And I think you see in the body cam how in the beginning they kind of do the right thing. They run up to the door, they try to engage the shooter, he shoots at them, they stumble back, one goes back, no one follows, and then from there on, the next 75 minutes or whatever is just this stasis. Like nobody's doing anything. No one even knows how to get out of this inaction, even though at multiple points officers are saying, what are we doing here? What is going on? Like they're clearly also themselves frustrated.
When you were on the ground right after, when 2 years ago, you did this documentary, now took a year, you finished it, now here we are, next month. will be the anniversary. What are some questions that you still have lingering? Because I'm thinking that one gets so heavily into a particular story, you almost you live it and breathe it and so forth. And I know we're a little further away in terms of time as it relates to what happened. I know there were lessons learned, hopefully, as you mentioned, in terms of the response. What are still some lingering questions, though, that you have that you still feel are unanswered? I know there's the case, that the grand jury or the supposed grand jury, in terms of trying to figure out what is happening. But are there larger questions that you still have? I know we have a lot of the details filled in terms of who was where and what happened as a result, and the outcome, of course, the ugly outcome. But do you have any lingering questions that are still pertain to what happened 2 years ago?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, so many questions. I mean, I think, it's important for listeners here to realize that we obtained this investigative file, but, we don't know, we believe that it is a lot of the file, but we don't know that. We have so far yet to receive many answers from any authorities, DPS, Uvalde PD, the city of Uvalde, the Uvalde County Sheriff's Office, specifically CBP, Border Patrol, which had 200 officers there, has declined to answer almost any questions or release any training files. And most importantly, those officers didn't have on hardly any body cams, right? So we can only reconstruct what happened based on officers that were wearing body cams, which is the minority of I think the ones we have, about 36, there were in all about almost 400 officers that responded. Now, not all of them responded before the breach, before the gunman was killed. But I mean, we're relying on that. We're relying on the interviews that we have that officers gave. I would say there was also a wide discrepancy. State and local officers gave extensive interviews versus federal officers often gave statements or very short interviews. And they declined to release their training records to us. So we also don't know how they are trained, how often they trained, like what training they had before they attended this. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of questions. We also, very importantly, because I know this has been raised online in other forums before, we don't have all of the phone communications. So we don't know, because lots of people were on phones. Like, we have radio communications and 911 calls, many which were featured in the story and the documentary. But we don't know, for example, at what time DPS Director C. McCraw was informed and who he told and what he said, or what other kind of phone communications was going on, when the governor was told. Like, those are all things that we don't know. And I think as a whole, the public wants to know that, and there should be accountability on that, but we don't have that. If we had that, I promise you we would have shared that.
Let me ask you this. I had emailed you just a little earlier this afternoon, and I had mentioned to you that I had received an email from Austin. And the individual that was emailing me from Austin was representing about what they said was a 3,000 to 4,000 Reddit group who is focused on Uvalde. And they asked me to ask a particular question. So and I wanted to write it down, so let me refer to it and ask you that. So this is a question about the public record, Ms. Kriel. And it's basically the following question: when does the public get to see the full record and not just an interpretation of that record? And then how does the media fit into that context? And what considerations go into a decision as to maybe not publish something? Last, when would the public be able to see the entire file?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. I think it's also a really complicated question. So thanks for the time to ask that. And I believe I've engaged with that person online, and other people have asked you similar questions as well. I mean, it's been going on for a while. So a couple of things that I'll say, again, just to be very clear, we have since 2022, along with ProPublica and the Texas Tribune, along with other news organizations, have been involved in an extremely extensive and expensive lawsuit to make these some of these records public, the records that we asked for. DPS has, a judge ruled in our favor last year. DPS has appealed that ruling. That process is ongoing. The city of Uvalde and local officials have yet to have their first hearing with our legal team. So if those records become public, we don't know what's going to happen. Those records that we requested, given that there will be redactions that will be agreed upon between the parties, will be public for everyone, right? Like at this point, we don't know if we post it on our site or if it will, but it will be public so other people will be able to gain access to it. In the meantime, while this is ongoing, at huge expense to our news organizations, we obtained, along with other media organizations, parts or wholes of this investigative file. It's very hard to know because we don't know what the whole file is, right? But we have a lot. That file, as I mentioned, is more than 2 terabytes. It is incredibly disorganized. It took us the past year to put together the information that we did. We went through more than 150 interviews, manually transcribed them, designed an AI tool, had to go through body cams to identify people, multiple spreadsheets to put these things together. Within that file, so much of this information is incredibly graphic. We are not able to release that information. I think the Washington Post did release some very small snippets of this information last November or December, and that decision in itself was controversial. I believe that they actually made the right call, but to be clear, that was such a small, it was just a few photos. It didn't even identify, there were no children recognizable. So much of this material is incredibly graphic. Families, it would be devastating, and it would also be, it's a difficult decision to make, to release that frankly is over my head, obviously, as well. But the other part of this is a lot of the information on here is private. It's social security numbers, home addresses, cell phone numbers that would have to be redacted. It's just, and beyond that, the volume of the material on this, it wouldn't even make sense if we put, even without all of these considerations. Something else I didn't mention is, just to be clear, this was shared with us confidentially. We have an obligation to our source to not put that person in risk who could be held criminally liable potentially for sharing an ongoing, investigative material. So there are multiple considerations at risk, but even if none of those were at play, if we literally just posted the entire file, it wouldn't make sense to anybody. I mean, I understand that, people on Reddit and other groups think that they could go through it themselves, but I mean, there's a reason that we have spent with a team of people this amount of time. We know that the public wants this information. We take this very seriously, which is why we're fighting the records lawsuit. And we have had discussions about ways in which it might be possible to release parts of this that wouldn't be graphic, wouldn't, violate HIPAA, wouldn't put out personal, cell phone numbers and social security numbers and credit card numbers, in some cases online. But again, I would like to just emphasize that at this point, we've done 4 stories and an hour-long documentary, many of which, quote, use the primary material in audio interviews and body cams and the transcripts that we were able to. So we have put, at this point, I think, more information from the file out there than almost any other news organization, and certainly more than any state or local or even federal authority. The DOJ did not publish any underlying material. So we already have put this information out there. I think the question, which is understandable, is can we publish the entire thing, is a lot more complicated for the reasons that are explained, which are legal, being sensitive to the families, actually violating criminal law. I mean, the HIPAA is a thing, right? There's lots of HIPAA violations in this because it relates to children's medical situations. So I would urge people to, while we understand that there is a real wanting of knowledge and transparency, we have done our best. We take this seriously. We see people's comments. And we are at the same time also fighting a lawsuit for this information. So,
Totally understand.
hope that's
Totally
helpful.
understandable. And again, I really appreciate the answer. Always grateful just to hear a perspective, right? We want information, but there are reasons why some things happen the way they happen. What you're about to see, again, I wanted to tell sort of a linear story tonight. What you're about to see is after Ms. Kriel had completed her documentary and it came out in December, we have the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, completing their DOJ report, and this is a press conference. I want to say maybe it's 2 minutes, and it's much more than that, but we just posted the 2 minutes. There's also over a 600-page report that they put out, and then after that, I'll come back to Ms. Kriel, just ask her a quick question as it relates to the DOJ.
Good morning. Last night I met with some of the survivors and the loved ones of the victims of the horrific mass shooting at Robb Elementary School. I came here to tell them that the United States Department of Justice has finished its critical incident review. In undertaking this review at the request of the then mayor, the Justice Department committed to using our expertise and independence to assess the law enforcement response to the shooting and to provide guidance moving forward. As I told families and survivors last night, the department's review concluded that a series of major failures in leadership, in tactics, in communications, in training, and in preparedness were made by law enforcement leaders and others responding to the mass shooting at Robb Elementary. As a result, 33 students and 3 of their teachers, many of whom have been shot, were trapped in a room with an active shooter for over an hour as law enforcement officials remained outside. I also told the families and survivors how deeply sorry I am for the losses they suffered that day and for the losses they have suffered every day since. I told them that the priority for the Justice Department in preparing this report has been to honor the memories of those who were taken from them. And I told the families gathered last night what I hope is clear among the hundreds of pages and thousands of details in this report. Their loved ones deserve better.
One of the things that was being raised in your reporting in the DOJ's 600-page report is sort of this lack of having an incident command post and an incident commander. Some people think it was Chief Arredondo. Some people were completely unsure who it was, and so forth. So that that continues to remain sort of this common thread throughout this story, is this lack, this failure. How significant, from what you've done yourself and your team has done, what you read from the DOJ as it relates to, again, this isn't your first mass shooting, unfortunately, I have to say that in terms of, you being a reporter. How significant is having an incident command post and being able to gain orders from that incident command post in such a situation as a mass shooting, and sort of the lack that we see throughout these reports about having one in Uvalde?
It's impossible to understate how important it is. And I mean, that's the number one failure that everybody recounts about the situation, is not only that Chief Arredondo was supposed to be the incident commander because that was the district's shooting plan, but also then that acting Uvalde Police Chief Mariano Vargas, who got there very early on as well, didn't question when Chief Arredondo didn't seem to be doing that, but also that any of the other many dozens of police, many of them supervisors from DPS, from Border Patrol, from other agencies, from the Uvalde County Sheriff's Office, when they arrived, they also didn't question, or at least didn't actively try to change the status quo. So, I mean, it is absolutely the number one thing that kind of led to this response going awry. But it's not only, I think, it's clear that this was not only the fault of one person, right? Because there were nearly 400 officers there, many of them better trained than certainly the school police. And so that's also something that we focused on in our reporting, is looking at active shooter training across the country. And what we found, which was frankly super startling, I covered criminal justice for many years, and I was very stunned to discover, along with my colleague Lexi Churchill, that 37 states require annual active shooter drills for children and teachers in schools, but by law, no states require that of law enforcement. Now, some agencies may and some agencies may not, but it is really this sort of patchwork approach. By law, it's not required every year. So I think, that's also one of the things that U.S. Attorney Garland mentioned. Like he said in the report, that their number one recommendation is to urge at least 8 hours of active shooter training for every officer across the country every year. And what experts told us, and we actually went to some active shooter training, exactly what's being mandated right now by Texas after Uvalde at Texas State. We attended a 2-day class there, training. And one of the things they said is that this repetition is so important, because in that moment, you freeze up, you forget. Some of these officers are just, they're new, or they do patrol. They're not used to this kind of situation. So this kind of regular training for what is really in some cases like this, kind of like a military type of situation when you're talking about the types of weapons that are being used and the tactics you need. So, I think that absolutely not having an incident commander was the number one flaw. And part of the reason was because many of the officers lacked training, and then it sort of set in motion this situation where kind of people were just stuck. They didn't know what to do, or they didn't act. Nobody was taking charge. I mean, as a professor, I'm sure you've been in that situation with your students, maybe at times as well, right? Things can quickly turn into chaos if people aren't giving directions and it's not clear what's going on.
And I know many officers were stating, we hadn't worked with these folks before. They have a different way of doing things. We got tactical, the border tac here, and we got this other group. And so, yeah, lots of those things. And so let me do this. Let me divert a little bit, pivot a little bit. I want to turn our attention right now to the families. What you're about to see is a city council meeting that occurred early March. I want to say March 7th in Uvalde. And in the city council meeting, it's a very short clip, maybe it's not even a little more than 2 minutes. But let me explain to you what you're seeing. You are seeing a situation where they have hired, the city council had hired prior to maybe 2 years ago, an individual by the name of Jesse Prado. He's a former Austin police officer, maybe 26 years on the job. And as a result of that, they had hired him for about $100,000. City council had hired him for about former Mayor Don McLaughlin had hired him for about $100,000. He came out with a 2-year, about 2 years it took him, and he came out with a report at the city council meeting on March 7th. At the very, very beginning of the meeting, please pay attention. All the way to the right of the camera, you're going to see Mr. Prado, who exits the building right after he gives the report. And this city council meeting is about 2 hours. I watched the entire thing more than once. You'll see Mr. Prado exit the building, and then after that, you'll see a couple of parents respond to his exit, and then I'll come back to Ms. Kriel.
Everybody that is signed up to have the opportunity to speak. There won't be any interaction with the council. We've heard this report, the council and I, for the first time tonight. We have not seen the report, so there will not be any comments from the council tonight.
Where did he go? Bring him back.
He has left the buildings.
Where did he go? He gave his report.
Bring him back.
Yeah, why?
Okay.
No, why did he leave? He has gone against everything that every law enforcement official has said, and he walked out of here without facing any questions.
Okay.
From us or the family, sir. Please explain why that is.
Okay.
Why would you allow that?
He
No,
gave,
I don't want to hear an explanation. I want him back. I don't want to hear an explanation. I want him back.
Mr. Cross.
First of all, I can't even say that I'm surprised. I mean, like he just said, I'm doing what I was told. Obviously, y'all told him what to do. Y'all told him what to say. And we already know this. Like, it's been 2 years. 2 years. But what I want y'all to do is I want you to look at AJ right here. Every single one of y'all. You too, buddy. You too. I want you to look at this child. Because this child survived. This child was shot. And he sat in there for 77 minutes while those cowards did nothing. You said that that was in good faith. And I'm going to reiterate that point. Good faith. Good faith is 77 minutes.
It feels so, so emotional. I've watched that several times, just in terms of the, there's no even words that I can express in terms of what parents have gone through. After your time there initially in Uvalde, I mean, such shock, such, I mean, there's again, just the depth of the tragedy. And now that you have been reporting over these last 2 years, and the people that you saw in the video, by the way, the first was Kimberly Rubio Mata, and then the second was Brett Cross. Very well-known individuals. Anybody who's paying attention to Uvalde, very well-known individuals, very vocal individuals, and many more parents speak on this video, by the way. I just showed maybe 2 minutes. Let me ask you a little bit about the families and the parents and survivors. There were many children who did survive the individual that Mr. Cross is bringing up. What can you tell us about some of the survivors in terms of how they're doing currently?
Yeah, so I'll just say that, that video, that meeting was absolutely heartbreaking. It gives me chills every time I watch that. I was not there, but my colleague Alejandro Serrano from the Texas Tribune was. And I think it's absolutely clear the anger that these families feel 2 years after the fact, when every officer was cleared and no real explanation was given, but also no responses were given. It was there was a sense of disrespect. And I think actually it was at San Antonio TV station KSAT that came out that investigator apparently had never received active shooter training himself. But anyway, so, we have spent a lot of time with some of the, probably more of the survivors in the last year, because we were trying to reconstruct what happened. And so, to be very clear, all of the children that we mentioned in our story, that was with the permission of their parents. I think that, as you can see in that video, I mean, obviously for the people that lost children that day and lost the 19 children and 2 teachers, that's a day that marks the rest of their life. They will never forget it, right? I mean, and how can you? But for the people, the survivors, the children, especially those in classroom 112, like Chloe Torres, who was mentioned in the 911 call, I mean, I don't know how and I'm not a psychologist, but I don't know how you recover from that, just what they saw, what they experienced, not only in terms of their friends and their teachers dying in front of them, but the fact that they waited so long to get help when they could hear police outside in the hallway outside. And, some of them have talked about that. And what their families have told us since is that, they have, many of them, if not all of them, most of them have struggled to return going to school, even in different kind of classroom settings, because they are afraid, the loud noises, they don't feel safe at school. In some cases, some of the family members said girls now don't trust men, that they feel that, men are dangerous because of, obviously the shooter was an 18-year-old man. I think it's impossible really for those of us who have never gone through it to understand that this remains with you every day and all you can do is just try to get through, but you never, I think, properly can. It's a horrific thing. But then what has made it worse, as I think is clear in that video in this instance, is the fact that families overall feel like they've been disrespected by the state, by the city, by the county, that they're very legitimate questions about what went wrong, who's being fired, if anyone, who's being disciplined, if anyone, and what's going to change, have been kind of, they feel like it's been swept under the table, and everything, every little thing is such a fight. So I think it's a combination of, obviously, whatever happened, everything that happened is unimaginable for any of us ever. But then you couple that with the lack of accountability and the lack of answers and the lack of any real responsibility from agencies at the scene. And that just makes, I think, that just breaks people and makes them angry, which is completely understandable.
Yeah, no, I'm in total agreement with you. Every time I watch that video, I was trying to prepare, what to show, what not to show, and just the level of shaking that you see Miss Kimberly in trying to get Mr. Prado back. And eventually he did come back and listen. He didn't take any questions, but he did come back. And so let me do this. If I can turn it over to Kiva, and Kiva, please forgive me. I'm looking at the time, and I know that you prepared at least 4 questions for Miss Kriel, but if you can give her your best 2, I'll be grateful, because I did promise the audience that I would allow for some questions. So forgive me, Kiva.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. I recently read one of your articles that was about 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks old maybe, titled "Nearly 2 Years After the Uvalde Massacre, Here's Been Reprimanded and Where Investigations Stand." And I have a question about the article. Here's a bit of context for the audience that doesn't know. The city recently hired a private investigator to investigate this case. How does the city representatives account for the rationale of these officers in that case specifically with the private investigation?
Yeah, so that investigator is the same one we watched just in the video clip. And I think part of the issue with why families are feeling very angry about that, and actually there's talk that potentially the city council is going to, I don't know if it's going to happen, but maybe, rebuke the findings, but they have not yet. But that's been kind of some of the talk. I think part of the issue is that, as the investigator says in his report, the city also lacked a lot of access to material. The investigator wrote that they only were permitted to have access to whatever the district attorney agreed that he could see. So, in some cases that meant that, that obviously limited the scope of what he was able to review. I think I looked through some of it, and in some cases there were officers who had since left the department that he didn't interview, and we in fact were able to see their interviews that they gave to the Texas Rangers. So I think there's a question about what material he had given that lack, and how he found, just it was such a contrast to the Justice Department report and the State House report, which really found that everybody was to blame. Now he found that they were cleared because they followed existing policy at the time, and that may be the case because there was some issues about the existing policy. But I think that the thing that is questionable about the report It's just that it seems to stand in such stark contrast to the other findings, and also the fact that he actually had very limited information relative to the State House and the Justice Department.
Thank you so much for that answer. And another question I have, just kind of slightly off topic, but I'm just curious in terms of all the reporting and investigations that you've done in terms with mass shootings. I just want to get your personal opinion. Being a young person and in El Paso High, actually, a couple years back, we had a pretty close call with a school shooting where our school was shut down, and it was really traumatic to see a lot of my peers who had been in that situation prior react in certain ways that obviously we hadn't trained for. But in terms of mass shootings and traumatic events like this, besides calling for gun reform and things like that, what do you think young people like myself and other college students could do to support these individuals? And also, what do you think cities can do, states can do, and the nation can do to support individuals that have been through such traumatic experiences?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I mean, I think that firstly, I don't think that, we didn't tackle gun reform in our story, but I don't think you should say aside from that. I mean, if people feel passionate about it, that there's all different ways, right? Like, in fact, the families of Uvalde raised a campaign to raise the age. That didn't happen, but there's, I think, lots of levels when it comes to gun reform. Obviously, I'm not advocating for any one of those, but if people feel passionate about that, that obviously is the number one issue, right? That puts America in a different place. That people here, an 18-year-old can go out and buy 2 AR-15s, But and I think that's the reason that we actually didn't tackle that in our story and documentary, because we sort of thought that, okay, well, if we're assuming that this is the status quo, this is what we've all accepted is fine, which it seems like politically at the moment that is where we are, then are we training police officers and students and teachers well enough to react? And what we found, like I said, is that, while it seems like we're training schools and teachers, 37 states have laws mandating annual drills. No states mandate annual active shooter training of police departments by law. So, and again, the Justice Department seemed to kind of concur with our findings, saying like, actually, every officer should have 8 hours of training a year. So I think training is one thing. I think also, wherever you live, like, have a very good understanding of like, what is the plan at your school district, at your college? Like, what's the coordination with, in El Paso PD, the sheriff's office, border patrol, DPS, right? Like, especially in border communities, like, there's a lot of law enforcement there, but like, does anybody have a plan of how they're going to work together? And what is that plan? In Uvalde, they did have a plan. The plan was the school chief would take charge, but when he didn't, there was no plan to like supersede that, right? So if I'm not a parent, but if I was a parent, that is the thing that I would ask of my school district. If I was at a college, I would ask that, like, tell me, what are your memorandums of agreement with other law enforcement? What are you going to do? Who's going to take charge when you get there and someone else can't do it? Like, El Paso Community College Police, if they are not able, because obviously they're not trained as well as GPS or BORTAC. If they're not able to like immediately do something, who's gonna, and what's the process for someone taking over? Those are some questions, but also, I think as students, you guys really are like, you're the future. So imagine what it is that the world that you want to live in. And that's where I kind of took issue initially with the besides gun reform, because our story was not about gun reform and neither was the documentary. But are all of these things the way that you guys think this should work? And if so, like, sure, there are legitimate debates about the Second Amendment. We don't have to go into that here. But, to what degree, like, does it make sense? Are there some restrictions that should be made or not? And if there's no restrictions, like, then do we just really have to ramp up training? And to what extent should officers be in military gear? I don't know. I don't have the answers to all these questions, but I think that that these are things that people should think about what is the world that you want to live in, and are you okay with the world that it is right now? And then specifically when it comes to El Paso, obviously that started with, racially tinged language that I think we've been seeing more and more of, unfortunately, in the last 2 years. And so just basically taking a stand at like this kind of rhetoric has an impact on certainly people who are not well, maybe, or already leaning towards that. When politicians or people in power use that kind of language, it's dangerous. And I think you can just at a basic level take a stand against that.
Thank you so much for answering. Really appreciate it.
Let me turn our attention to the audience. I promised some time for question and answers, and thank you, Kiva. I appreciate you being patient with me for questions and answers. I do see one hand up. Abraham, if you can unmute yourself, if you have a question for Ms. Kriel, please.
My question is, first off, what about the medical response to the Uvalde shooting? Because I was reading an article from the Texas Tribune and a different news source. On the day of the Uvalde shooting, her school bus became a makeshift ambulance. Sylvia Urgejas transported children who were wounded inside Robb Elementary School to the hospital. The terror of that day still haunts her, saying that literal buses were being used as ambulances. Like, what do you think caused that? Was the massive amount of volume of 911 calls just so much to the point where hospitals couldn't get to it because of so many 911 calls? Or was it because of lack of training, like the Uvalde police? I always wondered that. Like, if it gets to a point where literal buses are being used, like, what does it say about the hospitals and the 911 response teams?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And actually, I think that I co-wrote that story that you're talking about. We did it in collaboration with the Washington Post, looking at the medical response. So if I may, can I share this in the chat as
Yes.
well? I know the story that you're talking about, but let me share this one as well that I think may be helpful too. So basically what we found in our reporting is that as a result of no officers not taking charge, and there not being an incident commander until the very end when Bortak kind of arrives and starts to breach the classroom. There was very little communication with medics outside of the school, right? That was a major problem. In fact, there were only 2 ambulances outside of the school at the time of the breach, and most medics didn't know that there were, that anyone was injured inside or that they were going to breach. So that was a massive problem from the get-go. Like, there were, there were 21 dead, but many injured, and there were only 2 ambulances, like, right there. In addition, what is a common problem with these kinds of things is that when law enforcement arrives, they just get there as quickly as possible and they clog the streets. This happened in the Aurora shooting as well. It was a big problem there. And so again, this happened in Uvalde. So law enforcement officers, and you can see in the documentary as well, they're actually at points they're like trying to find keys so that they can remove cars so ambulances can go through. So because they literally couldn't. There was so much law enforcement and family, who were parked in the kind of streets leading up to the school. Another issue was that there was very little communication with the medical helicopters. In fact, helicopters were ready to land, as our article showed, in a kind of the field, like very nearby, and they were sort of told to stand down and wait at an airfield. And so as a result, when there were at least 2 children and a teacher they still had a pulse when they were taken out of the school. And one child in particular was very badly injured. And the highly trained Border Patrol medic who was working on him said, he can still make it, but he needs to get to San Antonio, like a highly trained ER hospital right now, like level, the best trauma facility possible. And they were trying to get a helicopter, but the helicopters were not right there. And so they ended up putting him in an ambulance. And, from Uvalde to San Antonio, it's about 70 minutes, and he died halfway through, 45 minutes in. But that means like if he had been, I mean, obviously, who knows, but if he had been medevaced, potentially, right? Like maybe he could have survived. So I think the issues with the law enforcement response heavily impacted the medical response, because there wasn't, like, what the experts told us is that there should be an incident commander on the law enforcement side, but also on the medical side, kind of working hand in hand, issuing these instructions, making a game plan. And because it was messed up on the law enforcement side, that extended to the medical side because they were not getting the information they needed. And also that, you know, there were issues about like who was taking charge on that front as well. So it kind of just shows you how it has this topple effect. But on the buses, right, like we also included that in our documentary, like injured kids were put in this hospital, including Chloe, and like badly injured children, I mean, were put in a bus to take them to the hospital. And while what we learned from experts is like, while that's not great, at that moment, you're just trying to get kids as quickly as possible to the hospital using whatever way necessary. So yes, it's not great, but it's better than waiting at that moment for an ambulance. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Abraham, I really appreciate your question. Think that it's important. Thank you so much, and thank you for paying attention. I mean, you know, there's these details, you know, really do matter. And Abraham, before I go to Dr. Valles, do you have any other questions?
This may feed into the information that was like missing, but I just really want to know the reason why Governor Greg Abbott was fed like such inaccurate information. Like, seriously.
So the State House report does go into some detail about it. I mean, essentially that, you know, he was being briefed by DPS, who interviewed some of the Uvalde CIC and Uvalde PD officers. But it was just kind of, honestly, it was just like this clusterfuck. And so like he was briefed by DPS regional director, I believe, who had kind of gotten some information, but obviously not the complete. This was in the immediate aftermath, and you know that information was not correct. I mean, the State House report goes into a little bit more in depth, but it was clear that there should have been more controls. The Justice Department report actually talks about that as well. That, you know, because part of what caused the issue was that he was giving, the governor was giving the complete opposite of what happened, right? And so in some cases it's like wait and get the right information, but still try to update as quickly as possible.
Abraham, I really appreciate your questions and your insight. I can tell you've done your own research on this, so thank you so much. Let me turn our attention to, thank you, Abraham, to Dr. Valles. I see your hand up. This is one of my colleagues, Ms. Kriel. Dr. Valles.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Ms. Lomi. Thank you, Dr. Archuleta Lucero and Kiva Lucero for hosting this important event. I'm curious if any of you have any updates as to whether any of the parents are going to be suing the state or the governor or any of the authorities that were there, kind of like they did to the Crumblies. I don't think that in the case of this particular rampage shooter, the parents are going to be able to, I believe the mother was living separately and he was living with his grandparents and the home was pretty much broken from what I've read. But are there any potential lawsuits? Because it seems to me that based on our culture here in Texas, as well as the way we've been handling rampage shootings, that's not going to change. The only time it's going to start to change is when we start suing respective to neglect or not following procedures, et cetera, et cetera. I know in Texas, I mean, we have a law that when authorities show up, police authorities, they are supposed to act. They are supposed to be proactive, and that was not the case. But we understand there was a lot of confusion, which the governor kind of sidestepped and hasn't really fully addressed in a way that is appropriate for parents who've lost their children.
Yeah, great question. So there are some civil lawsuits ongoing. Unfortunately, you know, there's federal and state kind of protocol called qualified immunity, which essentially shields a lot of government officials from being sued for doing their job or for lack of doing their job. So it doesn't mean it's impossible. It just makes it really difficult in some cases to bring that civil litigation. There is at the moment one kind of predominant lawsuit by Everytown, which is kind of a gun advocacy group against really all the parties. Daniel Defense, the maker of the gun, I believe they include the city, school district, and state as well. So that lawsuit is currently pending kind of a decision from the judge in the federal judge to sort of whether they can move forward or not. There have been I know that there's lots of lawyers talking about some have filed more civil cases, others are still trying to file more. But because of what I mentioned, just the fact that it's difficult actually to sue police officers for not doing their job in civil courts, I think, there actually haven't been as many lawsuits as you would think. The primary one at the moment seems to be that Everytown one, and the statute of limitations for civil cases ends on May 24th, 2 years after the fact. Although, they could still join in with the Everytown one. So I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what's going to happen there. But certainly, there's not as many civil cases as I would have thought as well, and they haven't progressed kind of to that point, like they're pending in many ways. On the criminal front, and that's what we saw in Parkland as well, right? There's the grand jury, and I think we're waiting to see what the grand jury is gonna do. In Parkland, they acquitted the officer, and it seems that may happen here as well, although we don't know. I mean, at the end of the day, it is hard to hold police officers or government officials accountable in civil and criminal courts because they are kind of protected for their job as a government worker, which is, that's just how the system is at this point. But we'll see what happens. I mean, I think there's enough anger and certainly in this case, enough examples of potential wrongdoing that who knows what's going to happen.
Yes, thank you so much for that response.
Thank you, Dr. Vargas.
Yes, it reminds me of the outcome of the Flint, Michigan water crisis and how the authorities, including the ex-governor, got off the hook. It's very sad. Thank you so much.
Jonathan Vargas, please. I think you're next.
Hi, yes, I just had a quick question. Maybe it has to do with the conversation, maybe it doesn't. I just wanted to ask to see if you did any investigations in regards to like increase in sales of weapons after the mass shooting occurred, and if there was any correlation on how maybe the police department maybe the police department would have gotten like something out of the shooting, like say like maybe they had like an increase in gun sales for the police or something like that.
I have to be honest, I did not pursue that lane of reporting. I think that, generally speaking, I think there is sometimes an influx, speaking to some of the families at Uvalde, after a mass shooting, some people feel that they need to buy weapons to arm themselves. And I know that speaking from family members in Uvalde, some of them felt that way. People who had never had guns before felt that because of what happened, they now needed weapons to protect themselves. I don't know that there's any correlation to law enforcement and whether or not they get more weapons. I mean, obviously I think we do know though that after these incidents, there's calls for more training, there's calls for more equipment, like ballistic vests and stuff like that. But I don't think there's like quite a correlation other than everybody just being like, what can we do to try not have this happen again? And unfortunately, it only happens after something terrible like this has happened, not before and not on the front end, right?
So you don't think, because look, in my perspective, the way that I see things, the police department is very well structured, and I'm pretty sure they already have system in place to train their officers, at least to some level, to be able to respond to situations like this. And school shootings happen very often, and it seems like they have a problem with the way they handle themselves when they go and respond to these situations. what I was kind of trying to say, do you think the lack of training and like like the lack of training and response is because there is like like um like a sense of profitability of not doing such thing? You get what I mean? Like you think that in order for us to have access to more weapons and more funding for more weapons, we're gonna do this lack of training for these. Yeah, they might be impactful events that happen, but the impactful events happen to the people that are affected, not necessarily the police department. I mean, what do? They just go and then they talk to the people and they make them feel a little better, and then they forget about the problem, and the funding keeps on going, and the funding keeps on going. What I'm saying, do you think it's it's set up that way to occur that way on purpose because there is a sense of profitability of bad things like this to be happening? Do you get the question that I'm trying to say?
I think so, and I don't think so. I mean, I think that's a very cynical worldview, and I hope that you can. Well, it's good to be cynical and questioning. Um, I think if you watch the documentary, you will see for yourself. The officers were heartbroken about this. I mean, some of them lost people they knew as well that day. So I don't think it's that, they think like, oh, we don't have to prioritize this training and then we'll get more out of it after. I mean, I just don't think that it works that way. Like certainly no government agencies necessarily, I think that like forward thinking in that way and also hopefully not that cynical. I mean, I don't think it's that. I think it is that you don't think it's a problem in your area until it happens to you, right? So I think it's honestly it is mostly that. I mean, I think police officers, we all may have different experiences with them, but for the most part, if you're joining law enforcement, there is some part of you that wants to help people, right? Like there are also some police officers that are corrupt, certainly, like, and that do bad things, obviously. But I don't think that it's quite that you can't make that extension in this case. I mean, there were officers here that lost their own loved ones. So I think this day will also remain with them for the rest of their lives. I mean, they are in some cases pariahs now publicly. So I wouldn't quite disagree with you there, but I think it's good to be questioning and cynical. Maybe just not quite that much.
And I know these are probably, Ms. Kriel, lengthy questions. I mean, some of your work has so much, depth to it. So I know that they're not, easy and a yes or no answer. It takes, a great amount of energy to be able to, answer such heavy questions. So thank you.
Kendra, so being a parent of three, two of which who attend a public school, out of all of your research and investigations, is there any advice or insight as to what we can do as parents to have some peace of mind or prep our kids for something like this if it were to happen again?
Yeah, I mean, I think great question. Like I said earlier on, I would just like reiterate that, be involved with your school board and with the police department and ask them what is the plans for this. Like as a parent, I would want to be very involved with the school district about what their actual plans are on how they're going to respond, who is going to respond, who's going to be in charge. So that would be step one. And on children, I mean, they go through drills. I think it probably does vary by school. But I mean, I think in general, the drills are some sort of version of like Reinhard fight, I think is the teaching. And what we found though is that the children certainly at Robb, they did all those things. They stayed quiet. They didn't speak. They didn't speak out loud, even in some cases when they were shot. They followed their training to the best of their ability. Obviously, they could not necessarily, some of them couldn't escape at that time, but that seems to be what experts say is the best option if you can. If not, like hide and stay quiet. I mean, one of the details that was kind of super heartbreaking in our story was that in some of these classes, the little children, 9 or 10-year-olds, even held up their little safety scissors if they felt like they needed to defend themselves. I mean, I don't know as like a parent, like how you talk to that to your child other than to say, this is what happens. Sometimes it's unfortunate and you have to kind of prepare them for the possibility in a gentle way because this is traumatizing stuff. I mean, I don't know. How do we prepare our children for something that no one, not even an adult, should go through, right? So I think that's kind of up to each parent. I do think probably like just having those conversations to some degree and kind of so that children to some degree know what they should do in addition to whatever they're taught in schools is maybe helpful. But the number one thing I would say is just really to get involved with the school district and the local police department, know like what their plan are and who you can call, and really press them for answers so that they're prepared before the fact, not after the fact, right? I think that would probably be my biggest advice.
Kendra, I really appreciate your question. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that perspective in on being a mother. It's important for all of us.
Hi. Thank you for your time. I'm sorry, this is maybe a broad question, but what do you think will be the best way to stop or at least decrease the percentage of school shootings?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that we have a proliferation of access to military types of assault weapons in this country that 18-year-olds can buy the day they turn 18, as happened in this case. At this point, it seems that people think that that's fine. I think that's still debatable, right? Like whether we think that's okay, to what degree. Should you be 21? Should you have some training? Like if you have been flagged as mentally ill, like some states have red flag laws, right? Like, so within the broad realm of just not of limiting access to guns, I think that there's many questions there. And I think that more debate on that, raising the age, those kinds of things, like it could help prevent it. I mean, it's undoubtable that school shootings have increased as there's been more access to military type weapons. In addition, it's also unfolded as there's been an increasing mental health crisis in this country. There's a lack of access to mental health. People, even with money, cannot find the help that they need, and then that's even worse, right? Like as your income decreases and lack of insurance and so on. I mean, counselors at many schools have been cut. Pandemic also was, not great for our mental health. I think we're dealing with a lot of stressors right now, but I would say that I don't think it's not one or the other, right? Because other countries also have mental health problems. So I think that to have a discussion about this without advocating for either, because obviously I'm a journalist, you have to have a discussion of, is it really okay for an 18-year-old to buy an AR-15, on a credit card the day he turns 18, and when he had already at that point been out of school for 2 years and for many years had been flagged as having possible mental health issues. So I think these things come together. Like how do we solve some of these problems? Like generally happy people are not going out and committing these types of incidents. So how do we improve all of our mental health, and as a society kind of build that? But that in and of itself, may or may not be the answer, because if you do have these access to weapons that of all kinds of varieties that really military service members should only have access to, according to some experts, I mean, it does seem that puts you in that situation where that might proliferate. I think those are the two things I would say should be evaluated comprehensively together, not just one or the other. And in addition to that, obviously, like I said, training. But that's really like a symptom of the situation that you create at that point, right?
All right, as we wrap it up, Ms. Kriel, first of all, second of all, third of all, I just really want to tell you how grateful I am that you said yes to this tonight. I know how valuable time is, the work that you're doing and the work that you and your team are pumping out from ProPublica and Texas Tribune about all the things that are happening in the state of Texas. I mean, the work that you have invested personally. I've read all your stories. They have, just so much heart and soul in them. And so I am just so grateful that you said yes to coming on. And I know I've been trying. I was telling somebody, I think I told you, your weekly, you're probably looking like, oh, look, there's Amber. Who would have thunk? Not this week. There's Amber. Every week I'm emailing you to see if you can come. So tonight I just wanted to say thank you. Kiva and I have a little gift for you. This is from us. I have one here. And I want to thank you on behalf of El Paso Community College for coming. I want to let you know too, you have an open door at El Paso Community College. We'd love to have you in person at any point if you're coming through El Paso. I know some of you, the work that you do here is still, your team is here. So please know that you are always welcome to come. And then Kiva?
Yes, I wanted to also thank you so much for your time and patience with all the questions, and the definitely thorough answers that you gave were amazing and a lot to think about. Thank you so much for your time, and we really do appreciate everything you've done for the community and the state of Texas. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. So thoughtful. And I just want to say thanks everyone for being on this chat. I know it's a lot to us to come listen to it. And for those, I just want to reiterate that, we don't have all of the answers, but we have tried to get at them. And so I urge for everyone that is invested in this to continue searching for the answers that you feel like are still lacking. I mean, at the end of the day, this is not just on journalists, it's also on the public, right? So I would just urge that, and thank you all for reading and watching and understanding that this is a work in progress.
No, thank you. And then if you'll just indulge me a couple minutes, Ms. Kriel, I just need to thank some people. But Carol, before that, can you get the picture of Manny up for me, please? You're seeing a picture of my colleague. On Friday will be his 4th anniversary since he passed away. This is Manny Mata Jr. And so I just wanted to take a second. I had asked his sister if she was going to be able to be on tonight to just, our colleagues wanted to remember him tonight. I think he and I are at an event here, some type of an event at the ASC building. And I just wanted to, if Betty is on, just to tell her, we haven't forgotten my friend. He incredible person. I'm a better human for knowing Manny. And then tonight, as we leave, I just wanted to thank a couple people. Of course, Ms. Kriel at the top of the list for coming and saying yes. My own Dean Susana Rodarte, thank you for being so supportive all the time, Dean, with your words, your kindness. Carol, my producer, whom I talk to almost on a daily basis. We're getting ready for this. Thank you for spending, nights up, Carol, looking at this. Very, very, very grateful to you. I really appreciate it. My son, Kiva, thank you for being with me, mijo, my heartbeat. Grateful to you for tonight. Appreciate you. Professor Barbara Sanchez for the flyer, for checking on me constantly. Super grateful for having you as a colleague. Professor Stepp, the rock is usually right next to me, and thank you for monitoring the chat, James. Thank you for always keeping me focused and sane. Some of the things that I think about and that I verbalize. And then last but not least, Professor Nevares, Teresa Nevares, one of my biggest cheerleaders, and continually always by my side. So thank all of you for tonight, my colleagues at EPCC, the government discipline, Josh Alvarez, and one of the angels, Andrea Lucero. So thank you, Ms. Kriel. Please think about coming to El Paso Community College in person. We'd love to host you. Thank you, everyone, for tonight. Really appreciate it. Thank you for your feedback. Thank you for your kindness, your generosity. Time is very valuable. So all good things for you, and we'll leave it at that for tonight. Thank you all.